Let's talk about how to fix Archivist Elysiana,
Hey, buddy, watch this.
a card which, if you look at the numbers from a purely logical or data-driven standpoint objectively, doesn't necessarily have like a crazy win rate. Probably a fairly healthy inclusion rate as well right now in the meta, so probably not a card you're targeting right at the top of your head for a nerf. It doesn't seem particularly problematic, but I think there's a bigger issue going on with Archivist Elysiana, and that is that she's making games last way too long, particularly in control warrior mirrors or sometimes the shamans who run it as well. When you can play an Elysiana and create copies via Youthful Brewmaster or Baleful Banker, you can add something like 20 plus cards to your deck, and that means you're not taking fatigue for an additional 20 turns. And if both decks are staying alive through those 20 turns, often games are going for like 45 minutes, an hour, more than an hour, and sometimes even going to the turn limit as well, where neither player actually wins, creating this really frustrating scenario where you've spent a ton of time and nobody has actually accomplished anything. That said, I've proposed a few changes in this video I think could help fix the Elysiana problem. Up first here, I have a version of Elysiana that requires that you still take fatigue damage even if you replace your deck. So the fatigue count still accelerates even though there are cards in your deck. And in fact, based on this wording, if you played this version of Elysiana early, just because you like desperately need to find something that's not in your deck right now, or you just don't have any other plays, you need the 7/7 for whatever reason, it actually punishes you even more so. Because even if you had normal draws in your deck, you start taking fatigue regardless. It's not connected to your card in deck count anymore. It's just a timer that goes up every turn. So there's actually kind of a secondary downside added into this card. But in those late game scenarios, what it means is you get additional resources. So there's still some like resource value and resource management skill that happens where you have to choose good things and maybe you need a couple brawls to resolve your opponent's board, but there's still that clock added to the game where fatigue is still relevant and the game won't just go on forever. It is eventually going to terminate. So I like that it doesn't steal the resource management portion of it. Like the value is still generated. It's just that you have to parse out this value in a reasonable amount of time as opposed to just playing towards these ridiculous in-game fatigue-less states. Now, I did change one other thing about this card. You may have noticed I made it discover 10 cards instead of discover 5 and add a copy, 2 copies of each to your deck. That was really just a wording thing to make it all fit on this card cleanly. Frankly, I think that's a simpler way to do the card anyway. It's weird to me that you're duplicating the copies. It gives your opponent a little bit more predictability in those scenarios, but I don't think that matters here. This just makes the card look a lot cleaner, feel tighter, and still solves the problem. My next change here is a pretty big one that fundamentally changes how the card works, which I don't always love, but I think it would certainly solve the problem. This battle cry for Elysiana would discover 5 cards to replace your hand. So instead of adding anything to the deck, in this case, it's just refreshing your hand. Now, that means, of course, there's no fatigue protection with this version of the card. Also, if you play this with a full hand, just looking for some sort of emergency in a pinch fix, you might be able to grab like a brawl, for instance, if you're a warrior. Whatever tool you're looking for, a big threat is possible, but you also risk, whiffing and getting some real garbage in your hand. Now, another notable use for this would be if you had an empty hand. This would actually be an 8-mana 7/7 that adds 5 cards to your hand. That'd be really, really good. I think that'd be incredibly powerful, and lots of decks might want to run that, but I think it's okay because they're 5 just discovered cards are not always going to be amazing. They're not going to be exactly what you need. A lot of just random minions that don't synergize. And I don't think aggro decks in particular would be able to use this super successfully. We've seen a similar kind of card with Azalina that's played a little bit. It might be a better version than Azalina in that same slot because it's a 7/7 instead of a 3/3. And you might be able to pick aggressive cards instead of your opponent's random stuff in their hand, removal tools and stuff. So I do think this version of the card would be good and would be a considerably strong legendary for a variety of different decks. So although this isn't my favorite change, I think it's important to discuss the possibilities of a card like this. Maybe you'd make it 3 cards, maybe you'd make it 10 mana. I don't know. If you want to adjust the power level, that's fine. But how do you feel about a card that adjusts the hand instead of the deck? And would that be a good way for Elysiana to go? Moving on here to another version of Archivist Elysiana. This one is a death rattle that replaces your deck with 10 random cards. So a couple changes here. First off, it being on a death rattle is important because it makes it susceptible to silence. It introduces a little bit of counterplay. So if your opponent wants to silence it and have some kind of answer, they can save that and probably help to avoid that scenario where you're getting 10 extra cards. Beyond that, they're random cards instead of discover cards. The quality of the cards goes down. Now, I will say in most cases with Elysiana, it doesn't really matter what cards in your deck. It's just the fact that there are cards there. Denying fatigue is what's really important. But occasionally, just giving you a ton of dud draws or card draw cards, for instance, could still really reduce the survivability and impact you have during all the extra turns you're buying with Elysiana, so it could backfire a lot more easily. So introduces counterplay and introduces lower quality of play after the Elysiana, which could just accelerate your death in the meantime because you're not making good enough plays. So in that case, I really think this kind of solves the problem on two separate fronts, but mostly I just like the fact that it has some counterplay outside of you killing your own Elysiana, which could certainly happen with things like shield slams, but then maybe you don't have the mana to Youthful Brewmaster or Baleful Banker, so even then it adds some complexity and some decision making that makes the card far less reliable and consistent. Here we have a version of Elysiana that's exactly the same from an effect standpoint, but I changed the numbers on the card in two ways, very dramatically, which I think is important. First off, I bumped her up to 10 mana. So right there, again, that makes it really hard to pull off the Youthful or Baleful Banker bounce on Elysiana, so you get maybe just one version. Instead of adding 20 cards to your deck, you only get 10. Beyond that, I gave her a 3/3 stat line instead of 7/7. So the turn you're playing this version of Elysiana, she's really, really weak on the board. The 3/3 stat line also means it'd be harder to keep her around through a turn for a next turn bounce with a Youthful or Baleful. But beyond that, it's also just sometimes hard to play your Elysiana if your opponent has a pretty decent sized board out there. You think, oh, I might die if I just spend my turn only playing this single card. That's mitigated a little bit by the fact that she's a 7/7 and presents a bit of a counter threat of herself. She can take some nice trades, but if she's only a 3/3 and you don't have any mana to hero power or play anything else, you're really committing a lot and putting yourself at your opponent's mercy in a lot of ways when you play this version of the card, because they might just run over you, and adding 10 cards to your deck doesn't matter if you've completely lost out on board and tempo. It may just not be worth it in the first place. So it really makes it more of a sacrifice. Now, I still think in Control v Control Warrior matchups that this version of Elysiana would probably suffice. Now, I think if Blizzard were changing this card, they'd probably just bump it to 10 mana and keep the stat line the same. I'm personally not sure that's quite enough. I think you really do need to make it a sacrifice when you drop this card onto the board, so that's why I tweaked both of these. That seems like it'd go far enough to hurt the card in a meaningful way. And then finally here, a change that's perhaps the simplest, and based on the wording of Elysiana, it kind of just makes sense anyway. What if you just discovered 5 cards and you only got a single copy of each in your deck instead of this weird double copy thing that happens with Elysiana? I don't even know why it's like that in the first place. It's weird that they chose that more complicated mechanic. So why don't we just remove the copying aspect and just drop it to 5 cards? So she still does give you some fatigue protection, but it doesn't go nearly as far on a single version, and it's just always halved, so it's 10 total over 2 Elysianas instead of 20 total. That's a really big difference, and will cut games out from avoiding that turn limit scenario. They'd almost never get to turn limit with this version of Elysiana, and might cut 15 to 20 minutes off the game as well. So I think this is the most simple and elegant fix. Just make it 5 cards instead of 10. It seems like it should have been this in the first place to me anyway. This one's the obvious number one choice. And there you go. Those are my 5 changes for Archivist Elysiana. I think there's a pretty obvious choice which one of these is correct, but I'm curious first off if Blizzard will change anything with this card. I feel like they don't want games lasting for 40, 50, an hour even. That's too long in their mind as far as I can tell. So I think this card might get a small tweak. Also, just for the health of the tournament meta, they might toss the competitive side of Hearthstone a bone there and do something, whether it's banning the card perhaps is a solution, or just nerfing it so it fixes it across the board. I think this card is a potential nerf or adjustment target. Again, even though maybe the stats don't necessarily point to it being incredibly powerful. Now, I'm curious, what do you guys think? Do you think it needs to be tweaked at all? Do you like Elysiana and the crazy late game scenarios for Warrior? I think some people probably do. I just don't think it's good for the game in general. I actually also kind of like super long games. You guys know I've had a lot of like 40, 50-minute, just absolute crazy games. They're usually really, really fun to watch on stream. So I would almost be a little bit sad to see it go. But, my logic for the overall health of the game sort of outweighs my personal opinions on this one. So I'm going against my instincts and saying this card probably needs a tweak. But I'm curious what you guys think. That said, leave your thoughts in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, game on.